Hi, this is Ken Gosnell with CEO Experience, and today I have the honor of welcoming Scott Ryser, who is the CEO of Yakabad, to our Well Done podcast. I'm excited to have a conversation with Scott, as Scott has been a leader in his business for over almost 20 years, and he's very passionate about kingdom impact and has recently released a book that tells his story of how he's made his business reflect God's glory. So, Scott, welcome to the podcast today.
Yeah, great to be with you again, Ken. Looking forward to it.
Well, I've been a big fan of yours and your company for many years. I've appreciated how you've led and how you are a servant leader, and of course, your heart for making your business look like God's kingdom. Can you tell us a little bit about your startup story? How did you get started as an entrepreneur, and how did you feel that calling in your life?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Northeast Ohio, so where I grew in the Rust Belt, so where I grew up, I don't even know that we knew what the word entrepreneur was. So it was a bit of a journey, but I was just always the guy starting stuff. When I was younger, I was always starting something or instigating something and so when I got into my career, and I always just kind of naturally gravitated towards the smaller companies or trying to start some new division or get onto the new project, so I could start it up. And I eventually came to recognize that that's just the way God built me, that I'm a startup guy. I launch things and I build things. And so that, of course, naturally then led to my desire to eventually start my own company. So,
That's awesome. Yeah, I love Ephesians 2:10 that tells us that we're God's workmanship and we've been created
mm,
for good works that God's prepared. So he's given you and prepared you as an entrepreneur and as a leader. And God does that on purpose. He has a mission
yeah,
for us in that business as we walk out our calling. So I love
yeah.
the name of your business, Yakabad.
Mhm.
It has an interesting meaning to it. Can you tell us a little bit about why that name and what's the meaning behind it?
Yeah, so I kind of gave you the short form of the startup story there, but there was a process where I was trying to start, and I had a bunch of false starts. Like I'd get all the pieces but one. I'd had everything but the sales, or I'd have everything but the cash, or I'd have, like a couple different attempts, and it was clear that if I was going to get it started, it had to be because God was in it. It wasn't going to get started without Him. And meanwhile, because I'd come to my faith later, I was like 29 when I gave my life to the Lord. And I grew up going to church, every Sunday, but never knew God. So likewise, I also knew that when I gave my life to Him, if it didn't work on Tuesday, I wasn't going to bother with Sunday. So just from the beginning of my faith walk, my career was going to be part of it. So you put those two factors together, and I started up what would become Yakabad right before the dot-com crash, and everybody was making up internet domain names then. So the domain name land grab, right? You had to make up a word so you could get the domain name, and I vaguely remember some guy had like the Persian word for surfer dude was his company name, and that wasn't relevant. I went back to Old Testament Hebrew, and Yakabad literally means God's glory. Kabod, the heavy, weighty, mighty glory, abundant glory of God, and Yahweh. And so that's where it came from. And yes, I did get the domain name without any problem.
Well, I loved it. Yakabad, your corporate headquarters was in downtown Frederick, Maryland, for many years, and you had your big Yakabad sign, and I just loved that right there in the middle of the city was the
Yeah,
testimony to honoring God. And it's hidden in some ways, but yet, which is a lot what happens in God's kingdom. Sometimes it's a little deeper. That's why Jesus talked in parables, right? That he wanted people to
yeah,
get out. So
yeah.
I love
It
that
was
name.
interesting because all the marketing experts I talked to in the early days, and let's be fair, I didn't even really know what I was selling back then. So, but everybody that I knew, friends that I taught, they'd say, that's a horrible company name. You can't do that. It'll turn people off. People won't remember it. They don't know what you do. But I knew it was just a stubborn resolve. I was going to do it because I was just going to have his name right. It was going to remind me, be a constant reminder that it wasn't about my ego. And sure enough, for a whole bunch of the beginning of probably for the first 5 or 10 years, literally, and I mean literally, everybody would ask me what the company name meant. And now it's maybe half the people, that I run into ask me what it means. But back then it was everybody, and I'd have to tell them. And and here we are, 20 some years later. So
Well, I love you talked about stubbornness, but it's really a conviction, right? Knowing your
resolve.
Resolve,
Yeah.
saying, hey, God's called me to this. I want to honor him with it, and I'd like to honor him through the name. And boy, what just a testimony that is from the early stages of your company, that you built it on a perspective or a foundation that you wanted to honor God in it and through it. So well done, man. Well done.
Yeah. Thank you.
You recently released a book, as you talked about your story of honoring God in and through the business and how it should reflect. And it's really personal. It's your personal story. Can you talk a little bit about the book and where people can find it?
Yeah. So I just, as I said, when I first came to my faith, I knew my career had to be part of it. And because I spent most of my time at work, right? Not in church. But I struggled to find, like, how do you do that? How? Like, the big question was how you did that. And I couldn't, in my circle of church friends and Christian friends, and I couldn't find anybody that was even thinking about it. And so I set off on this journey, and then that really came to a head as I started Yakabad. Now I was able to, kind of control the nature of the company, and it's been a journey, and that God has taken us through a lot of different stages of that journey, and for a whole lot of it, I felt like I was on an island, kind of. I didn't have other Christians to plug into that were kind of thinking about this, at least not in the same way, and so that's, I really felt the call a number of years ago, 3-4 years ago now, God telling me, it's time for you to write the book. And it's not so much a book about Yakabad. The Yakabad's just a laboratory in which the book takes place, where all the experiments run. It's really about this journey of living out my faith at work, and how do you do that? And that's the second big part, is the book's about the how. There's some about the why, and there's some personal testimony and stuff, but it's mostly stories about the how, not prescriptive or formulaic, but rather to show you the journey so that you'll partner with God yourself. Not to do it exactly the way I've done it, but that just gets you thinking about how you can partner with God as well in your own business. So that's the book. It's on Amazon. It's hardcover, softcover, ebook. There's not an audio book yet. I've had a number of people asking, but I haven't gotten around to that yet. So we'll see, maybe someday.
And you have a blog. I want to ask you a few more questions about your book, because I'm a big fan of it. And of course, I wrote an endorsement for it and put a 5-star.
You did. It was a great one. Thank you. And I appreciate that.
I appreciate the book, because I'm a big fan of it. But I love the how piece of it, right? That you really dive into this perspective of trying to have your company really, to your name and to your behavior, it's really to reflect God's kingdom in the marketplace on a daily basis. And it's not really necessarily principles driven, or it's not necessarily about, here's this formula. It really is a story of just how you did that. Can you explain a little bit more about making the church kind of part of your business, or making your business part of reflecting what the kingdom should be?
Yeah. So there's this early stage, and I went through it too, where, well, a lot of believers are like, well, can you even do this? Can you bring your faith into your Tuesday, out of church on Sunday and into your Tuesday? And that's sort of a transition you go through. And I struggled through that for a while, and had to pray through that and navigate that, and kind of learn some things that you'll see in the book. But the big inflection point for me was, I was probably a dozen years ago, maybe a little more now. I really sensed, I didn't have words for it at first, but I knew God was working on me, something about experiencing more of his presence moment by moment. And he
Mm,
was hitting me from all angles. My
wow.
business partner, Scott, calls it the divine conspiracy. You know, it just, he's hitting you from everywhere with it. And I eventually came to understand what the Lord was saying was, it's time to move beyond doing stuff for him and into doing stuff with him. And I no longer call you servant, but friend. And it's great to be a servant of God. And that's where I started and where most of us start. You know, you crawl, you walk, you run. And so if you're working on principles and you're honoring God with that and you're doing stuff for him, that's awesome. That's so much better than not having God at any place in your work life, right? So that's awesome. But then there's a point where he puts this apostolic call, and I really believe this is the big picture, and we've lost this as the modern church, this apostolic call to do what Jesus told us to pray, you know, that his kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth, in our home, at our workplace, in our city, just as it is in heaven, right? When you start,
Wow.
you know, take earth and substitute Frederick or substitute Jacobot or substitute my company name for it, it starts to, oh, that's what he's talking about, you know, to make it look like his kingdom. And you see, after he taught the disciples that prayer, and by the way, as I say in the book, I don't think Jesus would give us a prayer that doesn't work, right? So if he gave us the prayer, it's got to work. And he said about demonstrating that himself shortly thereafter. And then he equipped the 12, and then he equipped the 70, told them to go do the same thing. You know, the kingdom, you know, when somebody asks you what's going on, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, you tell them, and make their experience more like God's kingdom. And which is what Jesus did, and then he equipped them to do, and that call's never been rescinded. And so there's this whole big mental picture that, you know, I mean, I prayed that prayer for, I don't know about you, but I prayed that prayer for, you know, a bunch of years as a kid growing up and never knew God. And then even after I became a believer, it was probably a dozen years before the light bulb clicked on for me. Oh, that's what he's really saying. And so that's really what drives the book, and the title is At Work as in Heaven. And to do that, there's some natural kind of things that can happen in your processes and operations, but there's some super, like, you got to be partnered with God. Like,
Mm,
you can't have the kingdom without the king, you know. So, you know, there's this aspect of pushing into that relationship with him in there as
wow.
well. So that's
I love
there
it.
there that's it. That's the book in, you know, 2 minutes.
Well, it's hey, it was an exciting read all the way through it, and you talked about the real practical how. I think any business leader or any business owner that picks up the book will resonate when you talk about contracts and employee issues and cash
Cash.
flow, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and really in building a culture, the team around the how. So I think that's, but I love this, the best ideas, man, that you just laid, and I want our listeners to catch that moving from doing things for God to doing things with God. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
That's a significant step, right? And that God doesn't give us a prayer that's not going to work. I mean, man, I heard
Yeah.
that's just so fantastic. So, hey, we're going to talk about more about the how and a little bit with your culture, but that how also started with your partnership. And you did mention that you have a business partner that you've had since
Yeah.
the started days of Yakabad. I know a lot of our listeners are in business with a partner, or that they have somebody that's part with the business, partner with the business. So as any partnership can be difficult at times, it can also be a blessing. You've been with your business partner for 20 years, and you've done a great, been very successful in your business. Can you give us some secrets, or what have you found to be key components to having a good business partnership?
Yeah. So the backstory is that I started Yakabot. It was a consulting company or integration services provider wanting to be a software company. And we had customers, but we didn't really have software. Meanwhile, Scott, my business partner, had this software company, um, that didn't have any customers, but he had the software. And our mutual mentors introduced us and said, "You two ought to meet," and we did, and that became the genesis for putting it together. And I think one thing that was critical, that it happened because I got lucky, or it's God's grace or something. It wasn't because I was smart enough, really, but I understood what the core values of the company were going to be from the very beginning. They're right on the wall, well, the faux wall behind me here. And I knew what those were going to be, and that those were going to be, and that it was critical to be part of the culture. And I probably learned that from Jim Collins, Good to Great, or something, that it didn't matter what they were, but great companies had them. And so I had them. So when Scott and I started discussions about integrating his software company and my consulting company into the new Yakabad early on, we were able to discuss core values and understand that we had a fit there, that we resonated with the same ones. Because if we hadn't had those in place and we'd emerged, we'd have probably split. If we'd had a core values conflict in year 4, that would have been a really bad thing. And I suspect that's probably what happens to a lot of founder pairs. They get into it and they've maybe got a common vision or passion, but they don't share the same core values, or maybe they didn't quantify them so that they're not out there in the open. And so we came together when we did the partnership and merged together. It was around these core values. Now, of course, deeper than that, if Scott wasn't a believer, but he and I, in fact, it was probably his wife, Debbie, that was the one that convinced him first that, yeah, you need to do this. God's in this. But the fact that we both wanted to honor God with this, and that he was even more important than the core values, was also in place. So and just like any partnership, it's been work over that time. We've certainly had, things where we disagree, but we have a lot of things we agree. And the other thing that's really happened that's worked out so well, is even though we have some overlap in our skills, we each play a different role, and over time we've been able to delineate those different roles, and we're comfortable in them, and we work well together at the intersection of those two roles, and the roles are each natural for us, and so that's a big deal too. So
I love it.
All those things, I guess. Yeah.
So I heard a couple key aspects of that, of having the kind of the perspective of being together on your values and knowing what you're wanting to accomplish related to the business, having some differing gifts and abilities, and really honoring each other with those gifts and abilities, so that you're not trying to duplicate, but you're really trying to add to and be a valuable partnership, and then honoring each other through that process. I think, partnerships takes a lot of communication and making sure that you're continuing. You can't stay partners for 20 years without communicating together, right?
Grace. Way I point over the right shoulder there. Grace right behind me there. That's a big key, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, integrity, consistency, just like you were talking about. Hey, let's talk about the company culture for a minute. I know that you've worked really diligently, and that's one of the hows that you mentioned quite a few times in the book, as you talk about that in your culture, dealing with people, that's really sometimes where God's kingdom shows up. So can you talk a little bit about why that was such a drive for you, that you knew that the company culture had to be kind of a foundation to the company if it was going to be successful?
Well, there again, it comes back to core values, right? Not just with Scott and I, but with all the people we hire. And we had to learn that early on, how to make sure we were hiring people that resonated with these, like really resonated with these core values, not just, like kind of nodded their hat at them. And that took us a little while to kind of get that, but then the culture really in part becomes just the company living out its core values. The culture reflects what those core values are, and they're real things. It's not the poster on the wall, it's the things you really hold dear. And so then I think as leaders, Scott and I, our job is we define those core values, and then we put guardrails around them. We hire and fire based on them. We make sure our business processes operate around them. All that, we mentor or disciple or whatever around that. But then it's ultimately the team that sustains it, right? I mean, Scott and I have the guardrails on it and mentoring, but then the team, if the team doesn't sustain these core values and live them out, and then we don't really have a culture. And so I think, so part of it's that awareness, right, that I just described, that you have to understand. And it's really identity. It's really, who did God make you to be, and who did God destine the company to be? Because you tap into that identity, and then it's, are you being authentic to that identity? And certainly the core values are one way you quantify that. There are other ways, but that's one way you quantify that identity. And so, are we being authentic to who we are? And there's an awareness of that. You have to know who you are, and then you have to be willing to ask the question, are we being authentic? And then that second part of that is an intentionality. You have to be willing to always ask the question. And from my book, it's not just culture, it's kingdom as well. Is this the way things work in the kingdom, is one of the key questions. But there's a subset of that is this reflective of our core values, since that's one way we express the kingdom. And there's an intentionality. And I think too often people were just willing to let things, I was passive when I was younger with things like this. I had to learn that if it's a core values issue, or it may be some silly little thing. I wrote in the book about the coffee, how I understood that the coffee, was not just a good thing, but it ultimately not only tied into core values, but it tied into kingdom, capital K, kingdom. What we do with our coffee. And that seems like such a silly thing, but there's this intentionality to say, well, if the coffee sucks, one of the core values back here is excellence. What am I saying? Do I care about excellence or not? Is it really who we are or not? Because if the coffee sucks, then maybe we don't really care. And our coffee's pretty good. Well, it's really good, actually. A lot of people are talking about that.
Yeah. Everything I've seen at Jacobot is full of excellence and passion and integrity. And I love that word, authenticity, right? Because you guys are very authentic. You're authentic with your customers. You're authentic with your vendors. You're authentic with your employees, your team members, and you're authentic as you go and you build your products and services as well. I do think that you have one of the best products in the marketplace, and that it's a kind of a hidden secret. Can you talk a little bit about your software and what exactly it's designed to do and who it's designed to help?
Yeah, so we've got this niche. We kind of grew up in the intelligence community, doing more of a platform solution. But a number of years ago, we started transitioning our business model into much more niche product focused, rather than a platform or integrator play in the three-letter agency. So it is purpose-built case management for security professionals. And I think we're probably going to tweak that into a purpose-built response and case management, because it's not just about managing the cases that security professionals like CISOs or insider threat teams, or it's not just about the cases that they're managing. There's this response to an incident when it happens, and it's not all the Silicon Valley stuff with automated edge detection and activity monitoring, and that stuff's all an input, but once all that stuff happens and detects something, a human has to do something with that. And that's our niche. We're really good with helping the human do something with that. And of course, that market's not going to shrink anytime soon. That market's only growing. And I think the thing is just that most people don't know they don't know what they don't know. It's only, it's only going to grow. The need to build these dedicated security teams inside an organization. So that's the niche we serve. We have a number of, there's different teams. there's cybersecurity, there's counterintelligence, there's insider threat. We have niche apps for each of those types of specialized teams, but we think it's probably going to all kind of bubble up to an enterprise level thing, and we're ready for that too when we start seeing more of that in the market.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you've got, as you mentioned, government relationships as well as the private sector, and you work with both small and large companies. You really help any company, even universities and
Yep.
colleges that are
Yep.
trying to help protect their data and have secure case management.
Yep.
So I think that's outstanding. And you guys have stayed on the cutting edge. I've been appreciative of your authenticity to continue to improve and to develop and to grow as an organization. Hey, Scott, I was going to ask you that question about you have a growing culture. And one of the things you guys have continued to evolve over the last 20 years that you've been in business. I mean, your foundations have been strong, which we've talked about, as related to your core values and your mission to have your business reflect God's kingdom, and even your software product, consulting product from the very beginning. But the market is changing, the world is changing. How do you develop a culture around growth, and even as a leader, how have you known when to pivot or when to evolve a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a couple different things in there, right? We've had a lot of curveballs here in society at large, right? Who could have predicted the pandemic and the remote work and all that stuff that would have caused a big shift, right? And that had a huge impact on culture. As strong as our culture was, we still had to, and we were already more flexible than most people, but we had to figure out how to rebuild all that. But again, I just think it comes back to this intentionality, because that's a big part. We have these regular sync meetings and this rhythm of meetings that we use to keep us aligned and in sync. And they're by different groups and different functional areas, and some of them are just kind of stand up quick things to clear roadblocks. But we have an intentional every 2 weeks a corporate meeting where we all come together. And largely what we talk about it's whatever's going on in our culture right now that we need to, talk about. And I would, I wouldn't use the word discipling with my team. A lot of them aren't believers, and that would just sound like church talk. But that's what we are, is we're discipling our team in culture and in the shift of the business model, because not only did we have to shift our work style in Israel and the pandemic, we're shifting our whole business model, so yeah, it's intentionality. You got to keep at it. And even we, after 20 years, that's probably the primary subject that it's just about every one of there's some updates, but it's primarily about culture.
Yep, I love it. And I like the term disciple, right? I think we've gotten away from that, and I know it's church language, but I love the philosophy or the mentality of that we're going to continue to equip and disciple and grow, develop the people that God's put into us. And sometimes that's going to be growing from an educational perspective or a business perspective. Sometimes it means that we've got to grow personally, right? And then obviously sometimes our personal can go to our spiritual. One of the things that I love about, go ahead, did you have a comment?
I had this really neat, ties right into this. One of the guys came talk to me at the end of the day a couple of days ago, and he was reading my book, which surprised me. It surprised me he was reading my book, actually. I don't know where he stands spiritually, and that's between him and God, but he was reading my book, and he said he was about 200 pages in. He woke up and he was like, pulled it up on his Kindle at 3 a.m. And I thought, oh, well, here we go. He needed to go back to sleep, right? So, and he said, no. But it triggered him. He had been immersed in our culture for so long that he kind of had forgotten. Like when we talk at these culture meetings, is transparent. We'll talk about culture in our meetings. There's a transparency. It's not just a rah. There's the good. There's the bad. This is how we're going to move forward. The Jim Collins confront the brutal facts of reality, right? I mean, there's all that going on. And he had forgotten that the company he was in before, there was what they said in the meeting, And then after the meeting, you went and you figured out what was really going on, because it wasn't the same thing. It was like there was the fake news, and then there was the what's reality. And he had forgotten that that was a regular part of his workplace. And 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 so that's that was a beautiful story to me. That, yeah, because we kind of forget, we start to take it for granted here, that it's just going to work, that there's this authenticity to what we say, but that's not the way it is out there in most of the real world. And so I don't know where he stands spiritually, but through that he's getting a little taste of God's kingdom, or it's not perfect here, but our journey is to make it look more like the capital K, God's kingdom, than the little K, wrong one, right? So, and he's getting an experience of that enough where he's immersed in it, and he's feeling God's goodness, and every once in a while he gets a jolt of, oh yeah, that's what it used to be like. And that's God. The kindness of God leads to repentance, right? So that's a big part of what the experience of this culture is about. Is it's evangelism in a way that I was never graceful enough to do in my younger days, when I was just thumping you over the head with my Bible and apologetics or whatever. This is so much more powerful of a witness. So,
well, they're seeing the authenticity, and they see the passion that you have for them and for God's kingdom, and they're getting to experience that on the front hand. And we know that that's hard to deny. People are attracted to that. And I remember when I was talking to a leader years ago, and he was a fantastic soul winner. He was probably one of the best disciplers that I'd ever met. And he said, Ken, never forget, no perfect person ever saved anyone. And, and I love that perspective, because I think what he was challenging is sometimes, whether we're a CEO or whether we're a church member, wherever we might sit on the spectrum of our activities, we sometimes feel like, hey, we've got to have a perfect organization, or I've got to be a perfect leader, or I've got to be, have perfect knowledge of every question that somebody's going to ask before I simply showed them the kingdom. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about your authenticity of your book, as well, that you're just talking, here's real stories, real experiences, ups, downs, positives, negatives, but they're real. And your endeavor, your desire to try to have your business look like God's kingdom in every one of those situations. And that's why I just love.
Amen.
Hey, speaking of growth and passion and all that, one of the things I also love about what you've done is you not only wrote the book, but since you've released the book, you also have a blog and a place that where you're continuing to just express your ideas and thoughts about what's happening in the marketplace, in the world, and how a person might be able to look at those situations and see God's kingdom. Can you tell our listeners where they can find that blog, or how to follow you specifically, so they can stay in touch with what you do?
Sure. You can go to the website is atworkasinheaven.com after the book title, or simply awaih.com. That'll redirect there. And then I have an author page, under my name, my LinkedIn, Instagram. It's all under my name. So you just search on that and you'll find that. And yeah, we're putting up content, it's not like 3 times a day or something, but there's a fairly steady stream of there's an email list. You can sign up, subscribe to the email list on the website, and then you'll get the blog, new blog post to your inbox. And it might be about one of those a month, but then there's several times a week, content on LinkedIn and Instagram, and a video. I typically do a video, longer form video, about once a month or so as well. So that's what's going on right now. We'll continue to ramp that up. Yep.
And the desire around that is your passion, speaking about one of your core values, is to really help businesses and communities all across the country, and potentially all around the world, but really join on this mission of starting their business and growing their business to reflect God's kingdom, right? Can you talk a little bit about because I've loved that vision that you talk about transforming communities through transforming business, but you would really want those businesses just to understand how they can do the how as it comes to the different aspects of their business. Tell me about that passion a little bit.
Yeah. So as I wrote in the book, there's been this journey, right? The initial question was, well, can you build a company to glorify God? That's what the name was about. And then God shifted that question at the inflection point. Well, can you partner with God? And then the question became, well, if you're partnered with God, can a company look more like his kingdom than the wrong one? And just about the time I started getting my hands, well, I never really quite got my hands all the way around that, right? But as I started getting into that, he hit me with a bigger question. And it's, well, can an ecosystem of such companies help transform a community, make the whole community look more like the capital K kingdom? And I grew up in small town Rust Belt, Ohio, and it was like Mayberry when I grew up there. It was a wonderful place to grow up. We were already in decline. We just didn't know it yet. But they still haven't, like, it has not recovered from when I grew up. And I'm no youngster. This is in the 70s when and it still hasn't really ever quite recovered. And you're like, well, why not? It happened here in Frederick. Frederick was an awful place in the 70s, and there's been this rebirth of the community, and now there's plenty of kingdom stuff that needs to happen, right? But the economics, there's a vibrant economic community here. And so God really started working on this passion, to see communities like the ones I grew up in restored. And through, it's going to take more than just business. It takes government. It takes the education system. It takes the local church. It takes all these areas of influences. But business is certainly a key one, that can be a driver, a lot of those things. And so could you start, nurture an ecosystem of kingdom-minded businesses that were intentional about seeing their community restored? And so that's the call he has me on. And I mean, Jacobod's my day job. I mean, so I will continue to be a practitioner. I never wrote the book just to go on the speaking circuit and make a new career out of it. Now I do speak, but really to get the message out there, and I'll continue to be a practitioner, and mentor other businesses. But that's what I'm sensing beyond the blog content, and what I'm really sensing his call to. And you'll start to see the blog content and all the videos and the daily content start to move this direction. Is I'm sensing him calling me to build the workshop around the content in the book to really, I don't have a better word for it yet, but I'll say help a CEO or their exec team install the Kingdom Business Operating System. How do you, okay, you've got the business part, or maybe you need to do some strategic reinvention, but moving from that with or for God to with God, and really undertaking seriously this notion of, can we make our company look more like God's kingdom? So I'm building workshop content around that. Now I'll have the first pilot customer who will be very gracious with me because we're figuring this out on the fly. We'll start that in a couple weeks here, and that will turn into a workshop that we can do a little broader scale. So that's what's next. And this is God-sized stuff. This is not something I can do. I mean, I'm dreaming about transforming communities that are 6, 8, 10, 12 hours away that I don't even have a connection to anymore. But I really believe God is in this, and this is what he's called me to. And so I'm taking steps of faith, and we'll see what he does. There's no use dreaming dreams that are only as big as I am.
Right.
Company wouldn't be off the ground in that case, right? I wasn't big enough to get the company going on my own, one company, let alone an ecosystem of them. So it's a God-sized dream, but I believe he's in it, and he's going to equip it.
I love it. I talk about believe in asking the impossible. Jesus reminded his disciples, what's impossible with man is not impossible.
Yeah.
Right?
Amen.
And we've talked about Jim Collins a couple of times, and he was very famous for writing about BHAGs, your big, hairy,
Yeah.
audacious goals, right? And I wrote in my book, I said, it would be wonderful if God's entrepreneurs or business leaders could replace, and I'm not against BHAGs, but they could replace
Yeah.
BHAGs with what I called his G's, which are huge, impossible spiritual goals, right?
Amen.
That we just have this desire. And that's one of the things that I love about this vision that God's given to you, right? Because we know that it's not something that you can do alone or I can do alone. That
Yeah.
when God steps in, that all of a sudden that's when real kingdom magic, if you will, happens.
Amen. Yeah.
He's put
Yeah.
his anointing or blessing behind it.
Yeah. And this is really an apostolic call, right? The early church got this, but we've kind of lost this over the last couple hundred years. I mean, the early church was all about seeing the kingdom, spread and manifest. But, in the last, century two, I don't know, I'm no scholar here in this, but, we've been retreating inside our churches, and we built up this big church, but then we're not salt and light in the community. And I think that's God's calling us back to that. And I think more and more people, there's an ecclesia, a remnant that is really getting this apostolic call to no, God needs to be part of everything. Let's not lock him up inside the church building. He
That's
needs to
right.
be in our business.
That's right. And it's amazing when we start coming together to share ideas and to grow in our confidence. When probably 20 years ago, when I started working in Frederick, trying to find Christian business owners to connect with, I didn't know any Christian business owners in Frederick at the time. And today, I probably know a couple thousand just in my little town of Frederick. And that they're out there working hard to honor God in and throughout their business, and some are more overtly out there than others, but they still have that heart. And but God can do some amazing things when we start coming together to encourage one another, support each other, and challenge each other, which is part of what you're doing. You're challenging us to think about how should my business reflect God's kingdom, even all the way down to the coffee, which I just think is
amen. Well, and that's what CXP is, rolling out too, right? To bring people together, to leaders together, to encourage each other in the same thing. So yeah, we've got a common passion there.
Right. That's awesome. So, one of the things I do like to talk to leaders about, obviously, too, is that business is difficult and hard at times, and in God's kingdom, sometimes it's not always easy. What have you found through some of your difficulties or hardships? How's that helped you to become a better business? Can you speak to that just for a few minutes?
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of periods for, it's been up and down, and the periods of growth, and then it's, like the lean years, and then the, great harvest years. And we've had a lot of that. And we're going through one of those leaner periods right now. But I can see how the current one, as we've shifted our business model, and God will often give me, like, point the season to a specific, like he'd say, go look at King Hezekiah. And then the events around King Hezekiah kind of become a little roadmap. That's one of the ways he speaks to me. But there was recently here and through this lean time, I really felt him emphasizing generosity and gratitude. It's not time to shrink back. Do we have enough? And specifically, do we have enough for today? Well, yeah. A year from now it doesn't look so great, or 6 months from now it doesn't, but we're fine today. And so it's just this posture of generosity. And so through these, corporate meetings that I told you about earlier, we were actually able to mentor our team through a difficult period in generosity and gratitude. And I would dare say that our secular team of people from across the spectrum spiritually, several have outright told me they're atheists. We've got a whole spectrum. A couple I know are believers, but we've got the whole spectrum. And I would dare say that gratitude and generosity were more on their mind than many church congregations I've been in. And what an amazing thing. You've got this group of people that aren't all believers, and yet they're reflecting an aspect of the kingdom. and generosity and gratitude. That's amazing. And that wouldn't have happened if we were in a fat period, right? And I kept telling them, hey, there's going to be a period when the dam breaks open, and all this hard work we're putting in is going to bear fruit. The dam's going to break, and we're going to get the flood. And the time to learn gratitude and generosity is not then. The time to learn it is now, when you don't have much, because when we're prospering, we need to keep that same posture. And so that's one small example of, God using the lean times to, work a beautiful thing into our culture. So
I love it. And you really practice stewardship. What you were talking about is listening to God's voice and responding to that to make business pivots or changes, to press in or disciple where God is asking you to pivot. Stewardship is a completely, I say it's one of the most essential components of good leadership, right? Is trying to understand that we're just stewards of what God's given to us. And you mentioned that God's speaking to you and you hearing his voice. One of the things that I've recommended is that leaders get away from the business from time to time, either through a retreat or through their own personal retreat where they can go and hike through the mountains or just get away to hear God's voice. I know you've had a strong habit of really trying to get away to hear God. Can you talk a little bit about how essential that's been to you and your own personal leadership, and how God, maybe some other ways God speaks to you when you're out doing one of your adventures?
Yeah, I'll do some very intentional adventures where it's all about unplugging for a couple of weeks. Like coming up, I'm going to go to the Italian Alps and do this 10 or 11-day trek. And it's going to be hard, but it's beautiful, absolutely stunningly beautiful. And I will be largely unplugged. I'll have the phone for the GPS, but I won't be reading emails. I won't and I think everybody, most CEO, maybe it's a golf trip for, most leaders by now have figured out they need to do something like that. But honestly, I don't typically get my big ideas when I'm on that thing, that adventure. That's, I'm in the adventure, I'm enjoying the adventure, I'm recharging. But most of my good ideas, well, God ideas, the stuff I'm hearing from here and decisions that I'm, trying to process through with him, that just because I went out for a hike over in the woods over here, I'm out on a bike ride. In fact, I wrote in the book a couple of specific, like I was in really good shape the one season because every time I'd get frustrated, I'd go out for a bike ride. And they'd get longer and longer and longer. And I was frustrated a lot, but that's where I got all my good. So I was in pretty good shape because I rode a lot of miles. But he, I'd just be out there riding, not even thinking about the problem at hand, just trying to get away from it and just blow off some stress. And I'd sense his prompting, like, hey, maybe you ought to. I'm like, where'd that come from? And all, like, I know it's God because that wasn't my thought. And, and of course, then how to process that. Does it line up with scripture? Does it fit his character? All those things. But yeah, it's often just in the normal, get out, walk. I'll walk to work most days. And I get a lot just walking into work. It's about a 20-minute walk. And I get a lot of good insights from him just on that, so.
I love it. I love it. Well, Scott, you're just a fantastic leader and CEO, and I do highly recommend your book, At Work as It Is in Heaven, One CEO's Journey to Make Sunday Matter on Tuesday. And they can get that at Amazon and, of course, or on your website directly to you. I do encourage the listeners to sign up for your blog and follow along with what Scott's doing and sharing his insights of how he's seeing different aspects of his business or in the marketplace and how we can reflect heaven in it. It's off of that passage, and you can just tell that Scott has a deep conviction for this words that Jesus spoke, where he says, your kingdom, talking to God, your kingdom come on earth, your will would be done. So, Scott, do you have one final parting word for us or an encouragement that you can give us today as we finish our podcast together?
I just say partner with God. What's holding you back? Why not today? why not today? Because he's ready. He wants to partner with you. So push in.
I love it. Moving from doing things for God to doing things with God. And that is a great
Amen.
word today. Hey, Scott, well done. And thank you for being on the Well Done podcast.
Always good talking to you, Ken. Thanks, man.